Guess I'll get started. I'm Bill Schneck, researcher at NASA Langley Research Center in the Non-Destructive Evaluation Sciences branch. Brought on to do like modeling and simulation work, but on more like the physics modeling rather than statistical modeling side of the house. So kind of an important difference from what we've seen already today in terms of like less statistical models, more physics-based models, but kind of moving into the how do we validate those, because you can make lots of pretty pictures. I actually came from a gas turbine lab doing CFD before I came to Langley, and colorful fluid dynamics is a thing. Anyway, computer simulations of physical processes are increasingly being used in the development, design, deployment, and lifecycle maintenance of many engineering systems. Yay. Aeronautics, both with CFD for the actual aerodynamics of a system, aerostructures, and structural dynamics. You're dealing with very thin materials. They flex a lot. You've got to know the structural behaviors there. NDE is kind of a sister field on that in that context, where using any number of physical modalities, it's not a discipline in the kind of the conventional context where it's where it's one like type of physics. You have X-ray, ultrasonics, so you get double E's, MEs, physicists all playing together to try and understand the material state. And as the material systems get more complex, the flaw characteristics become more nuanced and subtle, and becomes a lot harder to characterize the flaw systems. So going into studies for validating your inspection systems, those get very big when those parameter spaces get very big, and that gets very expensive to try and cover that the way conventionally NDE has done that. So computer simulations can enable timely and cost-effective exploration of these highly dimensional parametric spaces, but it is very difficult to get a trustworthy model, as kind of seems to be the theme of today's session. So the objective for today is kind of cover the V&V problems from an NDE perspective, and trying to work on a means of improving the ability to rapidly and in a trustworthy fashion verify and validate NDE models. So obviously, kind of beating this dead horse, but NASA requires safety assurance of critical parts. A big mission goes up and fails. If James Webb had failed, that would have been huge problem for the agency. Similarly, obviously astronaut safety is of paramount importance. So we got to get it right. So right now we're moving towards key questions of, can we design these parts for inspection that we know the parts are inspectable before we spend all the money to build them and then realize we can't inspect the part? And can we detect and characterize these flaws? That's getting towards these complex material systems again. The SLS, which is currently up for wet dress rehearsal, is it uses friction stir welded tanks. That's a very advanced manufacturing technique, which creates very interesting flaws in the weld. Can we see those? We're working on modeling and improving our POD studies for that. But you also get that in advanced aircraft. That's an older figure from the old environmentally responsible aviation program, but they were looking at advanced materials, fiber composites in the airframes. Obviously, Orion, SLS, big projects need solutions to this. So moving on, I mentioned briefly previously the probability of detection, and that's a statistical measure of what's the likelihood that the inspection system, and this goes from total system inspection system inspector to assessed data. How likely do you find that flaw? POD commonly uses either a hit-miss binomial data or a signal response data for assessing. There's any number of metrics that are used for POD. For purposes of this discussion, we're going to kind of just assume we're talking about A9095, which is basically the probability that where you've hit you're 95% confident that you've hit the 90% probability of detection of the flaw. So, so there's any number of sources of signal variability, crack to crack, inspector to inspector, and system to system variations. Commonly, crack to crack is what's most of most concern. That's also one of the more expensive ones to address because you got to make bunches of parts with known defects in them, and making sure you've got the right defect in there is very difficult. So moving on, the next big thing moving forward is trying to achieve the model-assisted probability of detection, where you can use some experimental data and a model to try and flesh out your POD curve and get a better feel for what are we likely to see, what are we likely to miss. That's, getting at the ultimately what's an acceptable inspection system. So hopefully you can use a validated model to backfill some of the POD curve. But again, this requires a trustworthy model with a robust VMV framework. So, drawing from the AIAA verification validation guide for CFD, I use these definitions, which comes to, model is the conceptual, mathematical, and numerical representation for your given process. Verification is, did you write it right? And validation is, did I solve the right model? There, these are kind of if you want the pithy way to think about it, how do I think it works? Did I do it right? Did I solve the right one? So again, getting down to the verification. Verification is the model solving correctly? So doesn't ask anything about the physicality. A lot of this gets down to like software testing, software correctness, and software edge case stability, software stability, model stability. Making sure you've got you're solving the algorithm correctly. Validation is where you get into do we agree with reality? And that's a huge can of worms that's very difficult to do. Need our statistician friends. Does not immediately assert predictive capability, but as you build trust, eventually you use the model predictively. But that becomes that's the building of trust. It's George Box. All models are wrong, some are useful. Build up that trust for the given application. It's good. Well, terms, conditions apply, see store for details. So the major task is to raise that level of trust so that you can actually use it for the system. So, verification, again, this is when you're writing your codes, you get to really get into the software testing piece of this, but you really want to get into unit testing and, use your version tracking. Version control systems, Git is your friend. But, but you also want to, while you're in there doing the software testing, you can also start approaching your UQ aspects. If you can start getting systems like your adaptive sampling, you can work those into your testing schemes and build and have as part of your verification framework have assessments of the uncertainty of your numerical systems. So, try and work that out and try and get this automated. This also improves some of the reproducibility of your efforts, the scientific reproducibility problems. So, use the tools that exist. There's a lot of them out there. We kind of have looked at the the uncertainty quantification's been hit pretty hard today already, so I'm going to kind of glean through that. But, use the tools that are out there. Look at your grid sensitivities. Look at your parametric sensitivities. Use the tools that are out there. Again, all models are wrong. Some are useful. Validation is a process. You're never done validating. It's really once you've gotten to an acceptable level, you're done, but it's never proven. So, and it's important to remember that, because if you want to reuse the model, you have to reassess what level is good enough. And the fidelity requirements vary based on, mission objectives, anticipated operational envelopes, mission and safety assurance, budget. I mean, at some point, if you can't make the threshold, maybe you need to take an off-ramp. If you can't make the validation fit, if you can't do the validation within the organizational requirements. Again, and then validation for these kind of physics models, it's nice to work from a bottom-up level. You build units of the model, and you test those, where you've got one little piece of physics. As you layer in more physics, you bring the case, you increase the sophistication. You can do cheap unit tests a lot more than you can do big system tests. So layer your validation schemes. How am I doing on time? So. Getting into the experimental design, I mean, I'm taking a very, 90,000 foot view at it right now, but it's not just instrumentation errors. There's your part-to-part variation, material properties, geometry. These are systems. There can be thousands of parameters. You have to figure out what's important, and there's going to be some heuristics in that. You can't account for necessarily everything, because drive you nuts. And from an NDE perspective, you got to consider your inspector or your experimentalist. You've got frequent, even still now there's man in the loop on a lot of the inspection systems. Person holding the probe to the airframe, how long have they been at it? How, not just, there's career experience, there's how long have they been working on that shift, there's, are they going bleary-eyed, or what did they eat their Wheaties for breakfast? You gotta consider these things. Human element definitely matters. And then, of course, there's the tuning of the instrument. Frequently there's a lot of knobs, and they kind of like are, there's the dialing it in and getting the highest contrast they can get, but they don't necessarily record the settings. They just look at the peak-to-peak kind of thing. And so, some of that's getting at changing processes, that making sure that everything's written down or everything's recorded, so that you've got all the relevant metadata, so that you can bring it back to the digital space. And that's kind of getting at some of the questions necessary for the digital twinning that NASA's talking a lot about these days. So, and obviously we've been talking a lot about trying to get to a real, the validation question. How do they compare? Percent difference between values doesn't necessarily answer the question. You can have really tiny percent difference, but if your uncertainties are actually relatively tight, there's very little overlap. That's, that far right picture, I wouldn't say that's validated. Do you? But here you may have a very large % difference with values near 0, but pretty solid overlap, and that might be okay. You got to really consider what you're looking at. These are just toy functions that I threw up in Python, but the premise is, you really got to look at the uncertainty not just of your experiment, but also of your numerical system. Even for a purely deterministic numerical problem, there's uncertainties going in, which creates uncertainties coming out. There's uncertainties associated with modeling assumptions. If you take if you're doing, let's take elastodynamics to start with. You've got your mass spring. It's basically a mass spring system. You frequently ignore damping, frequently ignore second order, high order nonlinear effects. They're usually pretty small, but they are an assumption. They are a modeling assumption that may need to be accounted for. So you got to, watch the appropriateness of your modeling assumptions, and those do build into the kind of how you assess your uncertainties. So, talked a lot about kind of things that need to be watched out for. Frequently, models are developed by small teams who are more numerically focused, not necessarily laboratory technicians or laboratory scientists. And a quality validation experiment requires people with experience, can require people that have decades of experience, but you may not have that individual already in your project team, especially if this is an early development kind of project. How do you get access to good validation data? Because if you just put a keyboard monkey such as myself in the lab, well, I'll generate some data. You might not want to use it. So your modeling projects frequently have a little bit of money for running on computer systems. Do you have enough money to do the validation study yourself? Should you do the validation study yourself? There's other projects that, let's talk SLS with the friction stir weld. They're doing they've got a lot of money to already be doing the experimental work to generate the POD curve for the friction stir weld. Use the data from them in the development of a model for the ultrasonic inspection of that weld. Don't reinvent that. Don't reinvent that wheel. Chances are mine would come out looking like a rhombus. So, consider the appropriate. Consider where you can. I know you're not supposed to double dip, but when you're looking at, getting the correct data for, get the validation data. So the idea I'm trying to present here is developing a framework for a validation repository. Places, individuals, programs that have generated high-quality data with high-quality meta. We should be trying to accumulate these into a system where individuals where modeling teams can access that data and use it for validating for either model development or model validation. Again, the data partitioning there for test versus development is, especially if anyone doing the machine learning wizardry. And this has extra knock-on effects. This starts to create a more open science environment where you can start doing data stewardship. Other people can look at it and check for errors. If somebody made a mistake in the original program work, more eyes equals more better, more likely to catch the error. And this gives you, with the appropriate accumulation of metadata, whether it's a digital or physical recreation of the experiment, you can do the scientific reproducibility studies, and that's advantageous as well. there are historical analogs of this. There was a CFD validation repository from the 80s, 90s done by AGARD, which was a NATO CFD group. But this, high quality data gets better dissemination using something like this. So VMV is situational. It's always going to be applied to the application at hand. You're never going to be able to say, this model is validated. So the agreement is based on, the required level of agreement is going to be situational. So yeah, that's kind of the long and short of it. So, I think.
Okay, I did have one question. So we have a wonderful group of multidisciplinary people, and I know that for NDE there isn't a explicit framework for model validation and verification, but for other disciplines there are. Do you know of any that people in the audience who are working on model or simulation in their industry could start looking for those organized frameworks for aerospace or CFD or any of those things?
As I mentioned, there was the CFD framework done or validation repository that existed under AGARD, and that has some really cool stuff in it. A bit hard to come by, but because that one still required you to submit a letter and get it on floppy. So getting to be a few years ago, right? And but hopefully, there's the enterprise data framework that I know Jill Marlowe's pushing for NASA, and hopefully we'll be able to work some of the data access questions, at least on the NASA side of the house, in there, and the development of these more reliable access to high quality validation data for the development of these models.
Great, thank you. Anybody else?